birthday. 2 days before Beth's birthday, King Charles's birthday, and the bookie's favourite. So 14th of November, there's a real possibility of a new government. And it's clear that planning is going to feature heavily in that campaign. It's become a bit of a political football in recent years. And there was a very interesting blog. I don't know whether you follow Sam Stafford of the Home Builders Federation blog. He identifies or tries to put some context and explanation as to why planning is so political at the moment. He links it back to Brexit and series of policies that needed backing from backbenchers and support from backbenchers. Have a look at his blog because it's an interesting take on why it's so sensitive at the moment and so political at the moment. So we'll touch a little bit on that. It's probably everybody says it on when they're talking about planning policy at the moment. We've had 16 housing ministers since 2010. So when you're talking about putting plans together, it's no wonder that things are perhaps so uncertain at the moment. Anyway, we're gonna focus on the revised framework. The consultation that was published in December 2022 put forward some dramatic changes that we wondered whether or not would come through. Probably we haven't seen so many of those dramatic changes in what was published in December 23. More subtle changes of emphasis, I think, in a number of key areas. Andy wanted to call the webinar today It's All About the Footnotes, and I'll let him explain that as he goes through his presentation, looking at some of the changes that are going to affect housing supply, in particular looking at Para 61, Para 76, and Para 226 of the revised framework. He'll also address that footnote question, which you'll find at footnote 25, where they talk about islands with no land bridge that have a significant population of elderly residents. So, Andy, I'm not quite sure what that is, but is that the UK or is that another island that is being identified? Beth's going to explore some of the changes in terms of plan making. When you look at the framework and you look at paragraph 1, it's very clear that plan making is key to the framework. Key emphasis on the need to make plans. You will have seen action that's been taken in terms of Moore Valley in the last few days, and the emphasis again there on the need for districts to be putting forward plans. So Beth will explore that. We got a number of questions. We had asked people to put forward questions for us today. We've had a few back. People who've seen presentations from Andy and myself before know that my mum, who's 93, always sends in a question for Andy, or young Andy as she calls him. So she sent in a challenge for him, and she's logged on and will be watching in between taking in the Ocado. But we also had, I can't remember whether I've ever had this before, but we've had 5 questions from one delegate today. So I think Chloe Chamberlain, who's a planner at Thacombe, a graduate planner at Thacombe, needs a shout out just for doing that. So thank you, Chloe, for those. Right, we're going to kick off then with Andy, looking at impact on housing supply.
Great. Well, morning everyone, and thank you, James. So this morning, before I kind of get properly cracking into this part of the webinar, I want to start with an analogy. This came to me in the middle of the night a couple of days ago, and I want you to imagine for one moment the organ at the Royal Albert Hall. You'll see where I'm going with this in a minute. So massive instrument, 9,999 individual pipes. And if you've ever seen it played, it is amazing. And that is regularly played by someone called Anna Lapwood. Look her up on YouTube, on Instagram. She is incredible. And she's 28 years old. She's the head organist at the Royal Albert Hall. She's the professor at Pembroke College in Oxford. She's the youngest person to ever hold those roles, and the first woman as well. And she was rightly given an OBE in the New Year's Honours list. And have a look at her playing something like a Bach organ concerto or something by Poulenc, or even the soundtrack from Interstellar, the film. Hans Zimmer, amazing soundtrack, right? Now, if you don't know it, imagine a normal keyboard, but not just one keyboard, 4 stacked on top of each other, right? With all these stops and all these things coming out. And you see her playing kind of a melody with the right hand and then these chords with the left hand. But what's really incredible when you look at it on YouTube or her Instagram is then she plays the bass line with her feet. Okay, there's another keyboard that she plays with her feet while she's doing all of this. And it's absolutely incredible to see someone playing like that. It just makes, amazing music. But imagine for 1 minute then, rather than that organ in the Royal Albert Hall, that organ is the planning system, right? And imagine instead of Anna playing the organ, Anna Lapwood, it's Michael Gove, or it's me, or it's James, or it's Beth, or it's a council, or it's any decision maker, okay, looking at that. And rather than the music of a Bach organ concerto, what she's got up there, what that person got up there is the MPPF, and they're looking at that. And imagine for one moment then that instead of those melodies or ostinatos or motifs that you might be playing with your right hand, it's these themes that come through in the MPPF, like sustainability or the presumption in favour of development or housing delivery, all these things that we used to call the golden thread. And that's going through. And then instead of chords in the left hand, it's paragraphs for the MPPF. So it's individual bits on green belts or on design or on plan making. And then instead of those bits that you're playing with the feet, it's the footnotes in the MPPF. So all together, when you're playing those things, it starts to sort of make sense. Without all of those things, you don't get an amazing piece of music. You don't get all those things. And that's the way I think of the planning system. It's really complicated. It's really difficult. But every now and again, if you get it right, you make some pretty decent music. So this is all about the footnotes, all about what someone might be doing on that. And I hope that's helpful as we crack on. So sorry to go into so much detail, but let's have a look through then. And I want to talk a little bit through in terms of what those footnotes might be. Can we make that down in the middle? Is that for us?
Let me do it.
Yeah. Sorry, we're just getting rid of something in the middle of the screen. There you go. Perfect. Right, so this is probably familiar territory to many of you. This is effectively paragraph 11 of the framework, the presumption in favour of sustainable development. And that paragraph 11D is, again, very familiar ground as part of where a lot of planning decisions are made. Planning appeals are won and lost quite often around this part of the framework. And it's largely, in terms of that wording of how we interpret it, is unchanged, and it has been unchanged throughout the framework, really. And that basically says that where you don't have up-to-date development policies, then when you're granting, you're looking at that, and you've got to grant permission unless, and then part 1 is that you look at the applications of the framework that protect assets of particular importance and provides a clear reason for refusing the development proposed, and that then leads you into our kind of first footnote. We'll come back to footnote 8 in a minute. But again, that footnote 7, what we call the closed list of all those things of triple SIs, green belt, local green space, AOMBs, national parks, habitats, heritage assets, flooding, coastal change, that's effectively, again, unchanged between the old MPPF and the new MPPF. Those are the things where it says if you're in one of those areas, if you're in an AOMB or the green belt, you are effectively sent off to those parts of the framework to go and have a look at what they say, and those parts in the development plan and you would only then make a decision on that basis. So that is completely unchanged, no change there. The government could have changed that. They could have added more things into what's been called the closed list, but they did not. And then we've got, going back to that footnote 8, that then talks about, well, when are policies out of date? What does the government mean by things being out of date? And of course, we always knew that that meant a 5-year housing land supply, and it always meant that where the housing delivery test was under 75%, that effectively that would mean your policies are out of date and you would apply the presumption. So it's important going into a decision, into an application, into an appeal, of looking at whether that happens. But now we've got this bit within the framework that talks about, well, in fact, under paragraph 226, which we'll look at in a bit, a 4-year supply. So it's not just about 5 years. We've now got something that talks about 4 years. So we'll have a brief look at that and what that means, and what that means for decision making, and what that means for matters when we're applying this presumption. So if we go to the next slide, looking at this then, this is Surrey, effectively taking the whole of Surrey and looking at all of the boroughs across the Surrey area. And before the new NPPF, effectively, you would have the presumption applied. This is the new housing delivery test figures, which were released on the same day as the NPPF, but these are the new ones applied. But you would apply the presumption either if you had a less than 5-year housing land supply, or your housing delivery test was under 75%. So we can see those ones in red where presumption was applied previously. What's quite interesting, though, is when you do look at somewhere like Surrey, look at the whole of the borough. And it's clear to me when you look at that in terms of going forward, in terms of 5-year housing land supply, in terms of going back, in terms of housing delivery, that it's actually only a few of the local authorities that are doing effectively the heavy lifting in that regard. And the likes of Guildford, Reigate and Banstead, Surrey Heath, Waverley, in terms of housing delivery. And then we have some pretty low 5-year housing land supplies there. Epsom and Newell, less than a year. That's one of the lowest in the country. Tonbridge at 1.57. So there's some low 5-year housing land supplies going forward. Obviously, there's reasons for that. Those boroughs are heavily constrained. There's difficulty in meeting what are some quite big targets. But interesting, when you look at Surrey as a whole, their housing need in terms of going backwards on the housing delivery test was 14,978. And over the past 3 years, Surrey only provided 14,019. So they were 959 short across the whole of the borough, which shows, again, we'll come back and talk about this a bit later, in terms of meeting that need. Again, a big and important area for housing supply in the country is not meeting its need. And if you take out those top performers then, and the highest 4 performers, it's 3,600 less. So it goes back to those few boroughs doing the heavy lifting. And I think that doesn't go unnoticed by decision makers, by stakeholders in those boroughs, that they are by far and away with up-to-date local plans moving ahead when other boroughs perhaps aren't. And I think that gets looked at, and it's certainly something politically that is having an effect. And then in terms of the next slide, if you look at that in terms of Sussex joining authority, it's more red on that chart there, and things start to get kind of even worse. So in West Sussex, we're 648 short on the housing delivery test. In East Sussex, and I know this isn't the way that necessarily we look at the housing delivery test, this is just context, but 3,560 short in the last 3 years across East Sussex, and 4,200 across the whole of Sussex as a kind of county. Again, a few boroughs doing the heavy lifting. Again, some pretty low figures going forward on 5-year housing land supply. Again, constrained authorities, difficult plan making, some difficult decisions to be made across there. But that is the way that, in terms of what's happening now already, that's the way that the presumption was being. Now, we want to have a look then, the next slide, and look at how that gets applied and what it says. So obviously the presumption, paragraph 11D in that footnote 8 refers to paragraph 76. And paragraph 76 effectively says that local planning authorities are not required to identify a 5-year housing land supply if their adopted plan is less than 5 years old, and if that adopted plan at the time that it adopted it had a 5-year housing land supply. And then that effectively, you've got a footnote, another footnote there, footnote 40, that talks about the transitional arrangements set out in effectively footnote 79. So again, you're going through all these footnotes, and it leads you into different parts of the framework.
And is there a lack of clarity as to what an adopted plan is? I mean, that's not a stupid question, but there can be different interpretations in terms of whether or not there is an adopted plan, and perhaps at what stage have you got to identify whether or not there is a 5-year supply?
Yeah,
is that clear, or
it is clear, and there's transition arrangements that are set out in the framework around how that is applied and to what extent that's applied for existing plans and what it's applied to going forward. In my mind, it would be a lot easier if this was all set out, if you didn't have to go hunting around the footnotes. I think it does make it a little bit clunky in terms of navigating all of that, because you're kind of sent down to a footnote and then sent off to another bit, sent into the transition arrangements, sent back. And arguably, this is probably the most important part of the framework in terms of applying this. So it is a bit of a dog's dinner in my mind of these footnotes and how you kind of navigate all that. I think some of these things, rather than footnotes, could have been made clearer in drafting, putting them actually in the main policies in the framework. So then, in terms of, again, the transition arrangements, so it says clearly there that in terms of this paragraph 224, that applications within that framework are material considerations from the day that it's published. So it needs to look at that right from when it was published in December. And then you've got then a further footnote on paragraph 224, which is footnote 79. And it says, as an exception to this, the policy contained in paragraph 76, that's the one at the top, and the related reference to footnote 8 of this paragraph should only be taken into account when dealing with applications made on or after the date of the publication of this version of the framework. So my reading of that is that if your appeal now and your application was made before the framework came in, you're not dealing with paragraph 76. You're dealing with the old framework in that regard. So again, you've got to look at, well, when did you make your application? When are you coming in with that? At what point are you at appeal? So that's got to be things that going into an appeal, you're clear of, well, exactly what are you applying and why.
That didn't come out in the consultation draft, did it? So hopefully, I think quite a few authorities paused, waiting for this, thinking they might be caught by arrangements.
Yeah.
And really understanding those transition arrangements in advance would have been quite helpful.
So completely, and we'll talk about it in a bit, but the likes of Mole Valley effectively going on pause for a year whilst they were waiting to see what the NPPF came out with, and then the NPPF came out and said, well, this only applies to plans that aren't under examination. So it's and they say, well, that was a waste of a year, and I guess the government could have said, quite early on, look, Mole Valley or others, this isn't going to apply to you. This will apply to new plans. And it does create a bit of difficulty. And clearly, there was a meeting the other week, we'll talk about it in a bit, but that was clearly something that Mole Valley felt a bit hard done by. Right, so where are we? So slide, so into the next slide then, and looking quite closely at where then this might apply and where you've got, for instance, the likes of Elmbridge previously, that had 5-year housing land supply, or had only a 4-year housing land supply, now under those new transition arrangements, which we'll talk about a bit more, the presumption then all of a sudden where it was applying isn't applying anymore. And you've got areas like Waverley where they're just under 4 years now, where that is still applying. So again, you've got to look carefully, now very carefully, at housing delivery test, still important, the figures are still out there. And then 5-year housing land supply, is it 5 years, is it 4 years? So you've got to look very carefully when you're looking at that. On to the next one. So then this is what we're going to talk about in terms of those transition arrangements. And it says really clearly in 226 that for the purpose of this, from the date of the publication of the framework for decision-making purposes only, not for plan making, certain local authorities will only be required to identify and update annually a supply for 4 years with a buffer, as set out in paragraph 77, against the local housing requirements, and instead of effectively the 5 years. And it says this policy applies to those authorities which have an emerging local plan that's either been submitted for examination or has reached Reg 18 or Reg 19. And here's the important bit: it includes both the policies map and proposed allocations towards meeting housing need. And that doesn't apply to local authorities who aren't effectively required to demonstrate a housing land supply under Para 76. And then the clear bit on this is that this only applies, that transition is only for 2 years from the date. So we've got effectively until December 25 for that effectively applying. And
are we clear what a policies map is? I mean, it refers to, it says including both a policies map and a proposed allocation. Is there clarity as to what that is, or?
There is clarity in the regs around what policies maps should show, and there is some guidance in that. I think the main thrust of this is that it stops local authorities doing a high level Reg 18 issues and options of saying, actually, we're just going to do where do you think development might go? What are the key things that we've seen in boroughs like South Oxfordshire doing that? We've seen it in Lewis and other boroughs where they do a very high level sort of, we're not going to tell you too much of our thinking. We're certainly not going to allocate any sites. We just want to know what to do. And you have almost a Reg 18A and a Reg 18B in some of those authorities, and that's kind of led through plan making. So if you want that protection, if local authorities want that protection, and this is the government saying you've got to get on with plan making, they're going to have to show at Reg 18 that here's the policies map, here's the allocations, here's where they go. What's also interesting is that in the planning practice guidance, and it's yet to be updated, that refers to local planning authorities need to confirm at Reg 19 stage that they want that protection, that they want that kind of 4 or 5 year protection. So then local authorities would need to show, it's certainly kind of looking at how that works, that they're wanting to do that. And that they've made it clear, we want this protection. So going back, it's certainly for decision making, if you're at inquiry on something and the local planning authority are praying in aid a 4 year housing land supply, the question that begs is, well, did you make it clear during your Reg 18, Reg 19 that you were seeking that protection? I think it could be difficult for local authorities to show that.
And is that 4 years out of 4 or 4 years out of 5?
Well, here's the whole thing, and it's certainly not clear. And others picked up on this straight away. The moment that the framework came out, all said, well, how does that work? Is it 4 years or 5 years, or is it 4 years or 4 years? And it's not clear at all. The government have recognised that as well, and have said we are going to produce further practice guidance around how you interpret that. There was a note to chief planning officers just came out yesterday, and they said we're still going to come out with that. So I think we can expect to see something. I don't know when, hopefully soon, because it really needs that guidance of how that works. And that's just on my last slide, a kind of hypothetical point here of how that might work. Oh no, sorry, next one along. We've talked about that. So again, that kind of housing land supply, if you had an authority, and this isn't any particular authority, but if they had a housing target of 2,000 homes over the next 5 years, well, you've got to look carefully at how their housing trajectory works, because you're effectively wiping that last year off their housing trajectory. And if you look at it, if their housing 5-year housing land supply going forward was clear that they were doing 400 every year, or if it was on the left-hand side, they've got that 4-year housing land supply. If you look carefully at their housing trajectory, and it's clear that a lot of that supply was coming through from a big strategic site somewhere, and it was coming through in the last year. Well, when you take that out, they haven't got that housing land supply. So what it's going to lead to going into certainly into appeals is a lot more scrutiny on the housing trajectory, and it's beholden then on local authorities to publish that information. And quite often it's very difficult to find that and to look at how that works. And equally, I've heard in the last week or so where people are now going into an appeal because it's so important to try and get the housing land supply as low as possible. People are doing that deep dive, and you would do it anyway, but into effectively an authority that might be claiming a 4-year housing land supply of 4.3, 4.4, and getting it under 4 years. And I think it leads to a lot more scrutiny, and perhaps rightly so, but at an earlier stage. And I think some local authorities could see quite a big erosion of their housing land supply even further once people have done that deep dive. So I think we're going to start seeing that a lot more. So yeah, that was my quick whistle-stop tour through.
So no change in terms of the presumption, or little change in terms of the presumption, but some subtle changes in terms of 4 or 5 year land supply that we need to kind of look carefully at the detail or at the footnotes.
Yeah.
To kind of work our way through that. Okay. Thanks, Andy. Beth's going to pick up on. I guess you're going to start at the beginning, aren't you? Which is paragraph 1. I don't know whether your slide 1 is paragraph 1, but you're going to look at the impact on plan making.
Yeah, that's right. New wording, para 1, so I haven't let you down there. Unfortunately, I'm not going to start with another great analogy, but I'm just going to endorse yours, Andy, because I thought it was very good. Impact on plan making. So the NPPF is so important for plan making. It's a message the government are keen to get across with the latest amendments to the NPPF. Just to start, ironically, however, in September last year, Planning Magazine reported that 30 authorities had paused or delayed work on their plans or withdrawn them entirely. And of those 30, 15 referred to the government's proposed changes to the NPPF as a reason for pausing or delaying. And I think also there were some stats that came out. The LPTF, working with the HBF, also tracked authorities that were delayed or withdrew their local plans. And it was estimated that of those which had, 3/4 of those were delaying in the south, and including London. So a massive impact on our area. While some authorities have now resumed work, it's clear that LPAs and inspectors were not helped with making a decision about whether to pause the local plan examination, as there was no detail. I think, Andy, you touched on this in the December 22 consultation about transitional arrangements. So we now know Annex 1 of the NPPF says the policies in the new NPPF only apply for the purposes of examining plans which have reached Reg 19 after the 19th of March 2024. So some authorities didn't need to pause. Anyway, those issues aside, paragraph 1 does make it clear that up-to-date plans are the priority for the government. And Andy, I think what you've just covered as well further supports their emphasis. So authorities with an up-to-date plan, say less than 5 years old, will no longer need to show a continually deliverable 5-year housing land supply. And again, authorities where emerging plans have been submitted or where they're subject to Reg 18 or 19 consultation will benefit from the reduced housing land supply requirements.
But yeah, and equally, I think it's really important that they only get 2 years on that. And actually, in plan making terms, 2 years isn't that long. No,
absolutely. And alongside incentives for local plans, I mean, as you say, 2 years isn't long. There's also, with the carrots of the revised NPPF, there are the sticks as well. So Gove, in his speech before Christmas, said he was going to call out the local planning authorities whose performance was poor. This was followed by a letter from Gove to 7 authorities who had missed their plan-making milestones. I don't know if you've had a chance to read any of the letters in reply, but the one I read from Medway Council hit back quite hard in terms of setting out reasons why the government was to take responsibility for the delay of their local plan coming forward.
I think London did the same in terms of some of the questioning as to the constraints that they're facing in terms of of progressing with numbers.
Yeah, and then you've got the direction as well. West Berkshire and Mole Valley councils, so intervention threatened by the Secretary of State if they don't push forward to examination. I think we'll probably touch on that a little bit more. On the
This
next,
is Mole Valley going on the naughty step, is what you're about.
they're very much, yes, being put on the naughty step. The next slide just gives a little bit of background. I think we're all pretty familiar with one of the highly contentious issues around amendments to the NPPF related to altering greenbelt boundaries through plan making. And I think there's probably, and I go into a little bit more detail here because I think there's been some confusion with regards to the purpose of this amendment since it was published in the December 22 consultation. We don't need to spend much on background, but growing need for housing demand has resulted in local planning authorities needing to allocate land within their greenbelt in order to meet housing needs, or if housing delivery is faltered, particularly in areas where councils aren't on track to fulfil their 5-year housing targets. Arguments for applications being submitted for development in the greenbelt have also been strengthened. However, the NPPF test requiring exceptional circumstances to review greenbelt boundaries, or on the other hand, very special circumstances to allow building in the greenbelt, set a very high bar, and one that is almost always resisted by local members. As a result, you've got a lot of councils that are extremely cautious about their greenbelt areas and usually release protected sites as a last resort. So the pre-2003 position was set out in Para 136, and it was established that greenbelt boundaries should only be altered where exceptional circumstances are fully evidenced and justified through the preparation or updating of plans. I did just add, because I thought it was interesting, that in relation to a 2018 revision to the NPPF, there was some more guidance included on what would add up to essentially exceptional circumstances, old Para 137. And thinking at the time was that this was generally positive and the guidance could assist LPAs who wanted to change their greenbelt boundaries, as it would help them demonstrate how they could meet those exceptional circumstances. If we can go on to the next slide and whiz through to 2024, or end of 2003, 2004, you've got the new Para 145, which states that there is no requirement for greenbelt boundaries to be reviewed or changed when plans are being prepared or updated, and that if LPAs choose to review or alter greenbelt boundaries, obviously where exceptional circumstances are evidenced and justified, then any proposals for change should only be made through the plan making process. I've highlighted the words in change because the hotspots, it's they're not significant in terms of words. They're limited, and there's no real dramatic change in terms of the policy itself. Local councils were under no requirement to redraw greenbelt boundaries to meet housing need pre the 2023 amendments, and this remains the case. Councils may amend boundaries to meet needs, but there's no requirement to do so. Notably, in the December 22 consultation, it actually went further and proposed that councils would not need to review their greenbelts, even if meeting housing needs would be impossible without such a review. The end product, the new Para 145, doesn't go this far. There is no explicit statement that greenbelt essentially trumps meeting housing need. It's clear from this, however, the government messaging around this amendment is that they were increasingly aware of how politically toxic the greenbelt can be. There are a number of articles that came out leading up to the publication of the NPPF, criticising the government's approach on this. And actually, in the end, I think the government stated that they were simply seeking to clarify that greenbelt boundaries are not required to be reviewed and altered by local authorities, but they can still choose to do so if they thought that was warranted.
I think that one of the interesting things was in the run up to the Spelthorne local plan examination, there was a lot of questioning two officers and two people around. We don't need to vary greenbelt boundaries. Even then the NPPF said that. But officers, and rightly so, were very robust, and there's some really good things on the Spelthorne website, and Ambix and their team were effectively briefing back to members to say this is about having an effective plan. This is about having an effective plan that delivers for our housing need. If we don't go into the greenbelt, we can't meet housing need. We can't meet the needs that we've identified. It's a plan for flats. You're putting pressure on Staines and other areas, and really good messaging back to members of saying, yes, the NPPF does say that, but equally, this is about the next 20 years of your borough and meeting needs. And I think it's a real sort of go between the two, but it takes some strong officers and some strong people to go back on that.
Which is why I think actually these changes would worry planners as well as developers, in terms of those people making plans who know that actually it is necessary to look at greenbelt review, because essentially we can probably move on to the next slide. While the new wording does little to alter the formal policy position, the change in emphasis might have more significant consequences. And to your point, it might be members and politicians who can latch on to that change in emphasis and will be feeling emboldened to push back more robustly against the authority themselves if they may be seeking to make changes to that greenbelt boundary. I think the messaging is that you don't need to worry about meeting housing need if it's going to involve greenbelt review and greenbelt release. It doesn't necessarily say that, but it's definitely created some uncertainty, and it's unclear not only how that's going to be dealt with within local authorities, but also what approach the inspectorate will take to the issue of need, and whether they will allow greenbelt LPAs to avoid delivering sites when they come forward to the local plan examinations. Interestingly, while there's been no change in the key section in the NPPF governing decision making, last week you probably spotted there were 3 planning appeals that would have seen nearly 500 homes built on greenbelt land in the east of England, and they were all dismissed by planning inspectors within a few days of each other, despite the authorities concerned falling short on significantly short in some respects on their housing land supply targets. So planners have also expressed concern about the messaging that accompanies the amendments, and there's a worry that greenbelts will end up being kind of an unchangeable policy constraint on land use, so that even in places where there's a strong case made for review, it will not necessarily happen.
So a bit like parking the bus because of a football match in terms of
stagnate. Yeah, absolutely.
It's no movement.
It's stagnation, and concerns around this issue, I think you've alluded to this, have been picked up by Labour, who started talking about the need to get more authorities essentially to cooperate in finding places to build homes. Matthew Pennycook, the Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning, says a Labour government will identify regions where better cooperation is necessary to address, I think he said, huge unmet housing need. So in sub-regions, they're going to require local authorities to come together and put together spatial frameworks, and that is a place where they see greenbelt release being reviewed on that kind of wider strategic footprint. The caveat to all of this, I think I've put at the bottom of the slide, the general election looming, it does raise the question about whether the NPPF changes will be around for long enough to impact on the behaviour of local planning authorities in relation to their plan making.
Some of the discussion that has come from Labour on that, particularly Keir Starmer, is talking about car parks or brown sites in the greenbelt. Whether that's sufficient to meet the shortfall in housing numbers is probably going to be a key question that will feature heavily in the run up to the election.
Yeah, absolutely. And of the land that's being released for greenbelt, the percentages of new residential addresses being created within that are still very small. Sorry, next slide, actually, I've got some stats. Mostly I just put this slide on to try and compete with your good graphs and tables, Andy. But I thought these tables were interesting. The first shows that the size of the greenbelt for the past 2 years has actually increased, despite, however, if you look at the second, despite this, there are 10 local authorities that have reported changes to their greenbelt, and of that, 8 authorities did have a net decrease, while 2 authorities had a net increase. North Hertfordshire had the largest change with a net increase of 3,350 hectares, which I think has kind of skewed where we've gone with the overall increase. The explanation for this was that local plan allowed for approximately, I think, 1,000 hectares of greenbelt around that to be removed for a combination of reasons. So site allocations, insetting of villages that were previously in the greenbelt, and safeguarding some land. But to counter this loss, the local plan then added approximately 4,300 hectares of land to the greenbelt to infill the gap between the A1 corridor and Luton. So you can see how even in these sort of situations, if you're looking to release, it's being almost counterbalanced by other areas, essentially replacing that released land with new greenbelt.
That is what paragraph 142 of the framework, and now 147 always says that local authorities should look at ways of that impact of removing land for the greenbelt and offsetting it. So it's that greenbelt swap process that was being looked at with some authorities, but certainly not all. A lot of authorities say we're not going to go there.
No, absolutely. And we can come on to the problems that local authorities have in terms of the difficulty of getting kind of past members when it comes to local plan consultation, where they're looking to redraw those boundaries. Slide 6, back on to the NPPF. It's easy to go down a kind of greenbelt rabbit hole, but also there are other changes which will impact on how the greenbelt is managed. It's worth noting that councils can take historic over-delivery of housing into consideration when calculating their housing need, and also include permissions that include currently consented permissions into these calculations. Any calculations that reduce a council's housing need will limit arguments which may be made in order to demonstrate exceptional circumstances which may justify the changes to the greenbelt boundary. There's also the introduction of a requirement to consider local character when planning for housing need. It gives greater weight to views of existing residents who may oppose new development. If a review of the standard method goes ahead alongside amendments to the test of soundness to remove the requirement for local plans to be justified, those sort of changes will make it much easier to keep a local plan essentially up to date. We've had reports of some councils recording planning applications back to committee on the basis that they fall into the category of a council who no longer needs to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. And so there's clearly ongoing uncertainty in relation to housing policy for individual applications, but also, I would say, for plan making. And when it comes to making tough decisions about changes to greenbelt boundaries, uncertainty is just not going to help. If the NPPF amendments survive, it's likely to get harder for developers to bring forward sites, I think, through the local plan. The last couple, duty to cooperate, due to be abolished. How will housing be delivered in areas constrained by a higher percentage of greenbelt? I've touched on the fact that Labour are talking about that and talking about the way that they would like to take that duty to cooperate and bring local authorities together to essentially do some strategic planning. And then there's an amendment to the PPG in relation to paragraph 4 to make it clear when development can take place on brownfield land.
Let's pick up on something there, Beth. On the standard method, there's a really interesting post by Dan Usher, who's the economics director at Marron's, on LinkedIn, and talking about looking at the standard method. Mm-hmm. And the ONS data is starting to come out, the first post 2021 census data now, and they've had a look at that. And actually what it's showing is that, everyone was looking at the 2018 stats on ONS, looking at the 2021 things that are coming through. It's a lot higher. People were thinking it was all going lower. Yeah. And it looks like things like migration. We know we've had an up spike on migration. That seemed to be that it was under predicting it. So a lot of people were kind of looking at the standard method and thinking, if we go in that sort of direction, it's going to be less. But now it's looking actually, it was probably being under predicted. And now we've got the more, the newer data coming through, it's more. So it could be really interesting in terms of how that works.
The points on development taking place on brownfield land, I think there was a Savills survey that was out last week, week before, that was trying to predict the numbers of units that would be that would come forward if brownfield sites in the Greenbelt were allocated, and it's not a huge number. I think they were talking of something in the very low 100,000s. So whilst it's important, it's not going to be the answer in terms of reaching the numbers that have been discussed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then finally, the last slide's actually just taking a step back and at the same time looking forward, what's still to come. So we've got a further review of the NPPF. Joanna Aveley has said the next version of the NPPF will represent a bigger and even more complex revision to the changes made before Christmas and will be designed to incorporate the new planning system as is envisaged under the LURA. This would include national development management plans, which have been brought in, which are to sit alongside essentially the NPPF and will have the same weight as local plans, setting national policy in key areas. It's envisaged changes in relation to affordable housing, such as giving more weight to social rented housing in national policy and amending the definition of affordable rented housing, and also further measures to allow authorities to take account of historic oversupply in drawing up local plans. Consultation on a new version of the NPPF will be issued in due course. I should put in brackets, of course, in due course. And finally, you've got the first suite of national development management policies. The NPPF will cover principles of planning. The national development management policies will be given legal force by the LURA, will instead cover specific planning considerations that apply regularly in decision making across England, such as heritage policy or building on the greenbelt and flood risk. Further reforms in the process of local plan creation designed to make them easier and quicker to put in place. However, it remains to be seen, I think this is probably the conclusion that we're going to reach generally, whether some of these further reforms will indeed ever materialise, or to a lesser extent, whether any real progress will be made on them ahead of the general election.
Okay, so big emphasis then on plan making. Features centre stage. Those who've paused or delayed have done so for no reason, in terms of there's no benefit in that. And probably no change in terms of greenbelt that you've identified. So thanks Beth. We've got to be careful of time. I know we finish at 9:30, but we have got some questions. If people are sending through questions, please Megan, send those or post those up so that we can see them. I mentioned that we had a few. So my mum's question, and this is true. So what single thing or what single measure should a new government, assuming we're going to have it, well, we will have a new government. It depends on what shade it is. What single thing should they do to achieve the target of 300,000 homes a year, bearing in mind that the last time 300,000 houses were built was something like 1972, when Andy was, well, I'm not sure even Andy was that high. But before I ask you to give me thoughts on that, it's quite interesting to go back to the question as to what is Labour, what's the Labour Party saying it would do. I mentioned Sam's blog where he discusses the press release that came out in October 23. But there's also an interesting article by Matthew Pennycook, or interview with Matthew Pennycook in the FT a couple of months ago, where he's quite clear with some pretty bold statements in terms of what they'll do. Liberalise planning, reinstate building targets, release lower quality greenbelt land, priority for local residents for off-plan new build, fresh generation of new towns, and talks about a task force being appointed on day one to report back in 6 months. And as I said earlier, a big shift also in terms of policy statement. The 5 key missions that Labour identifies, planning and building features highly. Get Britain building again is very clearly stated. So with that as a little bit of a backdrop, obviously anything can happen between now and November the 14th. But it looks as if there will be a change in government. But what do you think? What would you be saying to people to get to that magic number of 300,000?
I would say that I think there's got to be an element of realism on both sides of it, and I think we're in a scenario now that the house building, the planning industry, the planning system, we can't get to that 300,000 under our current process. So I think to say we're going to get to it next year or even the year after wouldn't be realistic. I think what would be more realistic is for Labour to come in and say, look, that's our target. We're going to be there maybe in year 5, and there's going to be a transition up to it. We are going to get there. But those things that you talked about there, as important as they are things that take a long time to bed in. I don't think there is a magic lever that anyone can come in on day one and go, right, we're going to flick that lever, and all of a sudden we're building. And I think without keeping all of the important stakeholders in place and keeping some semblance of what we're in. So that's my thought process. I know it's a bit depressing, but I think there's just got to be a realism of where we are, where we want to get to, but the time that it's going to take to get there.
Well, from my perspective, it's probably not a very lawyerly answer, but one of the things the government can do is just ensure it properly starts to support the planning system. So the planning system clearly needs more resources, needs specialist skills, it needs more recognition by politicians of the important role it plays in delivering economic, social, and environmental benefits. So that it's that value that I think that can be started from day one.
It's interesting in the interview. He talks about, I think, an SDLT or stamp duty increase to fund some of those posts that you're talking about. Okay, fine. Let's look to other questions. I mentioned Chloe Chamberlain sent in a whole raft of them. Let's go with something we haven't touched on. But the NPPF does talk about in terms of design codes and the notion of beauty. So question from Chloe is with it being intended for authorities to deliver design codes, an interpretation of beautiful being so subjective and varied across authorities, is this likely to bring more delay to the plan making process? Does the NPPF set any parameters to manage this?
Well, I mean, we've seen this whole building beautiful coming in to the NPPF. We've seen the whole thing of refusing ugliness, the subjective nature of it. So in design codes, it's clear the government see them playing an important part. I think one of the issues is that plan making stage, quite often local authorities put that onus on the design code into an allocation or into the later stages of a site. So they'll say, right, that can come forward on the basis you have a design code that's done with local residents and how that works, which is fine, but then it does push that further down into the development management process and creates that subjective nature at a later stage. And actually, rather than a delay to the plan making process, I think it creates a delay to the decision making process and creates more ambiguity. So I think it's very important for local authorities during the plan making process to say, this is what we mean by design code, this is what we want to achieve, and more design policies within local plans, I think, are probably quite important. It doesn't answer the question, it doesn't bring about a delay. I think it probably should be more forethought during the plan making process, is my response to that. But
linking to what Beth just alluded to a few moments ago in terms of resources, if local authorities are dealing with having to interpret beauty and design codes, have they got the resources to deal with that?
I mean, some local authorities do and some don't. I think, it depends what kind of experience you've got within that local authority. But I, Andy, agree with you in terms of saying, actually, if it's going to cause delay, it's likely that you're going to see at the preparation, applications going in. If there's not a design code, it's then going to be something that has to be dealt with at that point as part of the application process. And their preparation may end up becoming the responsibility of an applicant who essentially needs to appoint a consultant at that time to work with the council just to try and expedite matters.
We've seen it also neighbourhood plans. It's not uncommon to have a neighbourhood plan come through, but also a separate design code that sits alongside that neighbourhood plan. Again, it's an important part of that process, but it does then, you've got to think, okay, you've done that, but what does that mean in terms of applications? How do you determine that? Like Beth says, and who is the person, who's the overall arbitrator of whether something's beautiful or not? It's difficult.
There's lots of Poundbury estates that we're going to have. Okay. Other question coming in again from Chloe. With Mole Valley District Council voting to proceed with their draft local plan, we alluded to this a moment ago. So with Mole Valley voting to proceed with their draft local plan, inclusive of greenbelt sites, do we envisage other authorities with similar greenbelt constraints to follow this precedent, particularly after the Housing Minister's warning to Mole Valley regarding implications for abandoning their local plan? Beth, that's probably for you.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably not a case of Mole Valley, emboldening other LPAs to take their local plans to examination with revision to greenbelt boundaries. I think it's more a case of councils who pause their local plans for any number of reasons, perhaps following Mole Valley in terms of progressing to examination to avoid Secretary of State intervention. I think Mole Valley actually clearly demonstrates how difficult it is to make decisions in relation to the greenbelt, and this combined with the government messaging that I spoke about, which is that they want local plans progressed, but also they aren't pushing for greenbelt boundaries to be reassessed, may lead other local authorities to conclude that it's just not worth tackling greenbelt boundaries as part of their local plans.
Yeah, and we've got now an interesting 6 months, a year ahead, some really important local plans coming through. Just 2 instances of that. Elmbridge, starting their examination later in February, they've decided to say no greenbelt release, despite having a Reg 18 that showed how they could meet their need and release some greenbelt. So that's going to be very interesting in terms of them having to demonstrate to that inspector how that's an effective plan, how that's a sound plan in making that decision, given that they did show how they could have made it with greenbelt sites. The other interesting one is West Berkshire going into their local plan examination. They were clear that they wanted to withdraw that plan. It was only after the Housing Minister's intervention that they didn't do that. So you've got a strange scenario of a local authority that politically doesn't want the plan that's being examined. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see then what happens with that plan and what that means. So, watch this space. I think it's going to be a really interesting 6 months, a year. And that's just 2 authorities. There'll be loads and loads of others that people will be involved in. And I think it's going to be interesting.
And maybe all change on November the 14th.
Or before.
Or before. A date for your diaries, I think that one. Okay. I'm being told to wind up in terms of time. So thanks to everyone for attending today. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Beth. I think what you've said has been very interesting in terms of just trying to tease out some of the subtle changes, the subtle implications of the revision. We'll be posting some notes and some video clips on the website. Follow Andy on LinkedIn. Andy's always got some up-to-date observations and comments on what's happening in the Surrey, Sussex area. Always really, really informative. And follow us on Crips in terms of the regular planning updates that we have. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.